Okay, good morning everyone. Nice to be here, and let me introduce myself very briefly. My name is Andrea Velich and I come from Hungarian University Eötvös Loránd Faculty of Humanities and from the English American Institute from the Studies of English Studies Department. And well, today I'm going to speak about teaching British history with films, which is not an easy enterprise. And the subtitle of my presentation is, as you can see, Philippa Gregory and her history novels on the big screen. But before I start, let me express my gratitude both to the organizers of the conference here at Kaposvár and some ELTE colleagues supporting the organization of this conference. And I would also like to thank for the technical support, without whom this presentation wouldn't be streamed. Well, let me come back to the title of my presentation. I teach British history. I've been doing it for quite a while, and with the new internet and Facebook generations, it's more and more difficult to catch their attention, to go down to the traditional history, to read records, primary and secondary. So we started a new program at ELTE Department of English Studies 2 years ago. It's called the Film and Culture Program. It's a specialization program, which we invented and launched because we thought that if we put the culture studies and the film studies in one bucket, then it would be more challenging and maybe more interesting for our students. And last year we could edit a digital textbook for the program as well, and some 16 colleagues contributed writing about literature and culture and history and culture. And so this presentation today is part of that program, and I would like to get started with my PPT. First of all, I would like you to get acquainted with some history and film books on the topic, on the subject. Some books about film theory and historical and heritage films. Of course, we have the traditional film books from Balázs Béla to Bíró Yvette, some Hungarian and foreign authors. I would like to call your attention to Győri Zsolt's book edited by Győri Zsolt, who teaches, if I'm correct, at Debrecen and maybe at Eger too. He wrote this book, fejezetek, or chapters about the British film history. And of course, we also work with some London BFI publications, including Helsby Wendy's Understanding Representation. Some art historians also write about this topic, art history and visual culture, including Hornyik Sándor and Kalmár György. And from the British authors, especially who write about history and heritage films, let me call your attention to Claire Monk's book, who is more interested about the audience of the British film books. Or films, including Jeffrey Richards' book, Films and British National Identity, and Váró Kata is doing research in Debrecen concerning the costume drama and British films. And we also work together or collaborate with film scholars at ELTE University, including Vajdovics Györgyi, who wrote about film theory. Okay, and this is the book we edited last year, Film and Culture, with my co-editor, Dorottya Jászai. I would like to give 3 chapters to my presentation. First, I would like to speak about history and heritage films. Then I would like to introduce you Philippa Gregory, And finally, I would like to present 2 case studies, including the Boleyn Girl series, and the other one is the so-called White Queen series of the BBC. Now, when we speak about history and history films or heritage films, it's quite difficult to give a proper definition what we mean by history films. First of all, we differentiate between the so-called period films, which is set in a certain historical period, then the biopic, which is representation of somebody's life, the monarchy film, which is about the British monarchy, for example, the costume drama, I hope it's obvious, and the quality or the heritage film. And James Leggett gave another 5 overlapping categorization in his book, and he says that a history film might be, or a heritage film might be a literary adaptation, it might be a biopic, it might be again a monarchy film, a war film, or the representation, for example, of the 20th century. Now, to clarify the difference between the history film and the costume drama, first of all, let me quote Cara McCartney, who in her 2002 definition, she says, the history film is concerned with actual historical figures, while the costume film is set in a recognizable historical period, but with fictional characters. Now, it's quite interesting that recently one of the heritage film authors, Belen Whittle, speaks about the so-called new syncretic heritage product. And she calls our attention to the influence and impact of the most recent star television writers, including Andrew Davies, Michael Hirst, and Peter Morgan, and who are partly responsible for, as she calls, the sexing up of the British history film or heritage film. Andrew Davies is infamous for many sex scenes in these history films or series, while Michael Hirst is responsible for lots of sex and violence on the screen. Peter Morgan was the scriptwriter of The Other Boleyn Girl. Now, a few things about the British film in general. Now, when we teach British films, we always call attention to the fact that there are so-called genre-specific British films, and usually they are subdivided as and labeled as the so-called merchant ivory products. Directed by Merchant and Ivory, and the so-called socialist realist British film, including Ken Loach, Mike Leigh, Stephen Frears, just to mention a few important directors. Now, in British film, we speak also about the so-called genre hoppers, who hop from one genre to another, including Michael Winterbottom, for example, or Danny Boyle. Now, there is a quite long debate going on around the British history, heritage, and monarchy film, namely how good it is in mythologizing the past, so how it reflects the past in a mythological manner, and as the American or the Hollywood cinema is good at presenting the American past in the Western genre, for example, the British film maybe is less genre specific. But I would also argue that it is our Hungarian-born Alexander Korda or Korda Sándor, who was the director who founded London Film Studios and also came out with many history films. And one of his best known films is The Private Life of Henry VIII, and which he directed in 1933. And he got famous with this film. He had a huge financial and aesthetic success as well. Now, to continue with film education, it is, when we speak about films, according to Mike Kirkup, in his 2003 book called The Film Education, he says that we might regard the film as history itself, or the film as a film to look into or examine the forms used, techniques, how the story is told, the language used in the film, or we might be interested in films in its context, social and cultural background of the film. And now, after this very short theoretical introduction, let me introduce you to Philippa Gregory, who is, I labeled, a little bit ironically, the queen of the British historical fiction, because she is a very prolific author. She published many historical novels. She is not a historian. Let me emphasize this. This is very important. One of the messages of my presentation is that it's very difficult when somebody is not a historian and then keeps publishing many novels, historical novels, and then these are adopted on the big screen or turned into films, and at the end of the day we see history as it is imagined by Philippa Gregory. That's the brief message of this presentation, and I included some interviews with Philippa Gregory. I intentionally did not want to judge it myself, or I would like you to get acquainted with her work, her approach to history specifically and in general. Okay. Now, first of all, some of you may have heard about Philippa Gregory because her novels, her historical novels, are even translated into Hungarian now and available in Hungarian bookshops, so she's coming on the Hungarian market as well. But she is extensively available in the last 15 years in Britain. The first of the Tudor court series she published was The Other Boleyn Girl, which came out in 2001, which was later on turned into different films, film versions. But including The Queen's Fool. I'm not quoting the dates, you can see the dates on the screen, but let me call your attention to the titles. The titles are always quite telling, okay? So it's The Queen's Fool, Virgin's Lover, Constant Princess, Inheritance, okay? So 3 more titles to bore you with. The Other Queen, The Taming of the Queen, 3 Sisters, 3 Queens. So it's very much from the women's perspective. So it's a feminist approach on the one hand. On the other hand, very popularizing or very popular. Now, let me show you 2 covers. Again, quite telling. She often writes about witches, and she is mostly concerned with witchcraft in her novels, and of course romance, lots of drama, and quite spectacular representation of women. Now, this cover, the second cover, the so-called Red Queen, is part of the so-called Cousins series, and in this series, she labels the Red Queen Margaret Beaufort, who is the mother of the first Tudor king, Henry VII. And Margaret Beaufort, who is a very religious woman, who is represented by contemporary sources as the woman who keeps praying all the time. In the film, or I will show you some parts of the film, you will see her quite differently. Now let me show you, Philippa Gregory is widely traveled, as you can imagine, and well marketed, and she appeared at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, and this academic lady is introducing her, so I thought I would prefer her to introduce Philippa Gregory in a few sentences. I hope it will work.
That Dr. Gregory is a remarkable woman who writes about remarkable women. We're delighted to welcome you, Dr. Gregory, to our audience here at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco and far beyond via distribution of this program on public radio and the internet. Born in Kenya but moving to England when she was 2 years old, Miss Gregory attended the University of Sussex, worked for BBC Radio, became a PhD recipient in 17th century literature at the University of Edinburgh, and received its Alumna of the Year award in 2009. Dr. Gregory has taught at several universities and was made a Fellow of Kingston University in 1994. Dr. Gregory, as many of you know, is a prolific author, and I know that many in this room have read all of her books. She has published an array of works, including short stories and children's books, as well as her award-winning historical novels, several of which have been adapted for presentation on television. Of special interest in this evening's conversation is her work on the Cousins' War, with the novels The White Queen, The Red Queen, and the just published The Lady of the Rivers, the story of Jacquetta of Luxembourg. Together with fellow historians David Baldwin and Michael Jones, she's published what we might call a companion nonfiction piece, The Women of the Cousins' War. In the book's introduction, Dr. Gregory discusses the difference between writing history and writing historical fiction, why her protagonists are absent from or seldom mentioned in the historical. That Dr. Gregory is a remarkable woman who...
Okay, well, sorry. What I wanted to show you is that Philippa Gregory is quite well received academically, but of course there are many critics and lots of historians, including David Starkey, publishing widely on the Tudors, criticize her, as well as others, including Susan Bordeaux. They question her works and books, says authenticity. In this interview at the University of Sussex, where she took a literature PhD, one of the research students is interviewing her, asking questions about the difference between the academic way of presenting history and the popular way of presenting history. This is hopefully a very short piece.
Got the record. So historical fiction can fill the gaps in a very powerful way, not just in a sense of somebody goes and then they come back, what did they do in the meantime, but sometimes what they did in the meantime for which you have no record is suggested by the records, but the historical fiction can genuinely, vividly bridge that gap.
I mean, history as an academic discipline, if we're kind of juxtaposing the two, is kind of commonly seen to be in decline at the moment. So kind of traditional classical books of history, people seem less interested in reading. Despite this, historical fiction seems more popular than ever in terms of your own work, books of Hilary Mantel, but also in terms of period dramas, so Downton Abbey and even Mad Men. I mean, why do you think it is that fictitious representations of the past are so popular at the moment? And is it a good thing that people are getting their history through this kind of medium?
It would be disastrous if that was the only way they were getting their history, but certainly I know from what my readers tell me and write to me, a lot of people start with the fiction and then go to a history. And although academic history, school history may be in decline, I really think that popular history, history on television, documentary history is really, really thriving. I mean, I notice how many programs people ask me to contribute to, what the interest is in the history behind the novels. So I really think that what we're seeing is a revival of history in a certain way, and that's going to spill out. So I think there's a lot of people at school now who are reading about the Plantagenets, who will then take an interest in history and go on to university and study probably something else altogether.
So history's kind of evolving rather than necessarily declining and kind of changing the way it's communicated.
Like everything else, it comes in and out of fashion.
Yeah.
But I think what's happened is what really inspired me at Sussex, what I really learned at Sussex, was the new history, which was the history of, both micro-history and radical history, and the history of dissent and the history of poor working class people, race history and women's history. In a sense, that was a takeoff, that was a new fashion in history, which has come through from everyone in my generation. So people like Simon Sharma like that sort of history too. I love that sort of history. My fiction is like that, Sharma's history is like that. And that's, I think, inspired a whole new wave. So really what I think you're seeing is the tail end of a less, to me, less interesting form of history and the rise of a new form.
Well, in recent decades, history has been kind of recalibrated by what's widely referred to as the cultural turn. So historians are turning their attention more to the stories that people use to make sense of their world and their past, rather than pursuing an objective truth or past. Do you think there's any kind of relationship between this intellectual change and development in the last few decades and the growing popularity of historical fiction?
Absolutely, I do. And I think there's a dialogue, because basically what we're talking about is narrative. And I think there was a time, certainly I experienced the end of it when I was doing my A-levels, when you were required to study a document, and really it could have been it could have dropped from Mars. It was it was not related to anything else. It certainly wasn't related to anything you might be interested in, for fear of getting people interested in history, it would be disaster. But then I came to Sussex, and I actually didn't come to Sussex to read history, I came to read English, and I just fell in love with history, because what I discovered here was a narrative which I hadn't even known existed. And it was a narrative about dissent and a narrative about oppression and class warfare against it. And that was just a thrilling, but it's a narrative.
It's still a story, but
it's a story. And I think really that what we're seeing is the rise of history as a story again.
Yeah.
And it, it was like that, and then it went out of fashion. Now it's kind of
reclaiming that.
Yeah, I think so.
Its nature.
Okay. It's as I've already mentioned, it's not only the historians, including Stephen Gunn doing research on the Tudors at Oxford, and Caroline Barron doing research on women in late medieval London at the University of London, who I was very lucky to work with in the past. They are criticizing or questioning this type of historiography. But as you can see, Susan Bordeaux called it self-decepting and self-promoting chutzpah, which is not a very positive description of Philippa Gregory's works. So as you can see, there is a kind of a fight between the so-called academic and the so-called popular history view or history approach. Now, before I go on, I would like to tell you that the first case study I would like to present is about Anne Boleyn, who has been portrayed quite often in history since the beginning of the cinema, since the silent movie era. She is a very popular character. It's very interesting how in the next, hopefully shorter interview, Philippa Gregory discovered Anne Boleyn. Now, when somebody either learns English or or British history, then we all get acquainted with Anne Boleyn as the second wife of Henry VIII and as part of the Reformation package. And I think the significance of Anne Boleyn is not only about the love affair between her and Henry VIII, but also the consequences of this relationship, the divorce of Henry VIII, as we all know about, the Reformation, the English Church, separation or break with Rome, and so on and so forth. Now, it's quite interesting that Philippa Gregory discovers herself the other Boleyn girl, who is not Anne Boleyn, but Mary Boleyn, the sister of Anne Boleyn. And she is going to speak about the discovery of Mary Boleyn, which is very interesting, and I'm going to comment on that in a minute.
We're here today with Philippa Gregory, who's the author of The Other Boleyn Girl, among many other books. Thanks so much for being here. It's a total privilege to be able to talk to you today.
I'm really pleased to be here, thank you.
This is a story about Anne Boleyn and her sister Mary, Mary being the narrator of the story. Mary is also a person who, over the hundreds of years of history, has rarely been discussed or talked about. How did you discover the character of Mary?
I wasn't really looking for her. I was doing research into the Tudor Navy. I thought I wanted to write a novel set in the Tudor period, something about the seafaring and the movement of Britain, like over the waters, really. And I came across this account of a ship being launched, and the name of the ship was Mary Boleyn. And I had so much not heard of her, like really everybody else, that I thought that's got to be wrong. That should surely be Anne Boleyn, you know, of whom I have heard. And I was in a library. I looked up her name because I was there, and there she is, but she's not in the historical record very much. She's in the footnotes, so she, you know, most histories mention her. But Henry had other lovers. I mean, she doesn't make any big difference to England. She's not like Anne, whose marriage causes a Reformation. She's just a woman that he had for a few years and then put to one side. But the more I found out about her, the more interesting I found she was.
So how do you know when you're going down this historical path and you're getting a little bit more excited about this sort of unknown person and you're starting to, you know, feel like there's something here? How do you know I have a story? And this is something no one's done.
Yeah,
I can't wait.
I think the real breakthrough moment was I was reading around, and then I found that she had written, of all of the letters she may have written in her life, we have only one. And that's because Thomas Cromwell, Henry's secretary, kept it, which is just, you know, thank God for that man. And it's when she's left court, Anne's become queen, and she leaves court and just disappears from the record. We really don't know much about what she does. But she wrote this letter to Thomas Cromwell explaining, and she says, "For well might I have had a better man of birth and nobler, but I dare swear, not one that would have loved me, nor that I would have loved more. I would rather be married to him than the greatest queen christened." And I read that letter and I went, this is a woman choosing her own lover, her own husband, at a time when women simply aren't allowed to do that. This is an extraordinary woman.
Okay, so as you can hear, she is not researching something, but she comes across this record, okay, but then she is filling the dots when she finds one letter, and then she realizes that it could make a good story. But if we take the historical accuracy or the picture, the greater picture or the context, then it would lead to a novel called The Other Boleyn Girl, where it's not only the position of Mary Boleyn which is inflated in a sense. She is represented as a very influential woman in the Tudor court, not only the lover of Henry VIII before or during the affair with Anne Boleyn, having a son, but there is no mention of the fact that Mary Boleyn, by the history records, was also the lover and favorite of Francis I, the French king at the time. So the story itself is completely different if we check out more history books, primary, secondary, or more well-researched novels, okay? So that's the problem or the question mark with Philippa Gregory. And now a little bit about Anne and Mary Boleyn. Mary Boleyn was not very much in the film, in representation of the film. until Philippa Gregory discovered the other Boleyn girl. So usually we have some films on Anne Boleyn, as I've already mentioned. The French silent film from 1914, there is a German silent film, so even international films were made about the representation of Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn appears in the 1969 Anne of the Thousand Days film, where it's directed by Charles Jarrett. And then we come to the second period when Philippa Gregory writes her novel, The Other Boleyn Girl, in 2001, and some films are coming out on The Other Boleyn Girl, which is Mary Boleyn. And there are two versions. The first version came out in 2003, and I wonder how far you heard in the first introductory interview that Philippa Gregory worked for the BBC. So she is not only a novelist, but she is also part of the BBC stuff. And the BBC directed a film in 2003 called The Other Boleyn Girl. The director is Philippa Lowthorpe, and it's a mock documentary, so mockumentary in English, and it's very interesting because they had very little budget, and it's partly because of the budget, partly because of the British film industry is based on the documentary tradition, and it picked up after during the Second World War, and so it's very influential in the British history filmmaking or heritage film, the so-called documentary industry. So it's a minimalist film, I would say, but because it was quite successful, Hollywood picked up the topic, and Justin Chadwick in 2008 directed another film which is better known because of the cast, Scarlett Johansson and Natalie Portman plays Anne Boleyn. Now let me show you a very short part from the BBC version of The Other Boleyn Girl. Oh, sorry.
Another. We have promised ourselves to one another. I have done nothing to dishonor my family.
Do not talk to me about disgracing your family!
Are you a fool, Anne? Anne! Answer me, girl!
Yes, madam.
Henry Percy is betrothed to another. Wolsey himself made the match.
Okay, well, as you can see in this very short part, the British film traditionally is very much as described by Andrew Hickson, the staginess or stagey feature. So it's staged, it's like a theater performance, and as you can see, this very short scene or sequence, Anne Boleyn is discussing this marriage issue with the parents. Now, I would like to contrast it. Unfortunately, things were, the DVD I possess couldn't be, I didn't want to show parts. It takes a long time to show sequences. So I found you the trailer. I would like to show you a few sequences from the trailer. It shows the contrast between the two films, that it's much more spectacular, lots of costume-wise and castle-wise. The so-called mise-en-scène is very colorful, so it's completely different from the BBC version.
The King and Queen, once happily married, now barely speak. The failure to provide a male heir has consumed them. I imagine it won't be long before he seeks solace with the mistress.
An opportunity has arisen, an opportunity in which, were you to succeed, you could secure for yourself or this family incalculable wealth and position.
Mary, Your Grace. Anne's sister.
You've been here all the time. How could I have overlooked you?
Please don't be angry with me. You think I desire to go for this purpose?
All I know is that a man that didn't know who you were was with you in that room for half an hour and came out besotted. Don't know what you said. Did
nothing, sister, except sing your praises and talk about my husband.
Really? Well, you must show me how to do
You are to entertain the king and keep his mind on Mary at all times. That is your task and no more.
I find you much changed, Mistress Anne.
Then my prayers have been answered.
Why did you come, Anne, if all you desire is to torment me?
Perhaps now you know how it feels to be deceived by your sister.
Take care. Because he'll only do to you what he's done to me.
You should not have given yourself so lightly. These are the consequences.
Okay, maybe I stop this trailer here because partly some of you may know the film itself, and I just wanted to illustrate how Hollywood is reaching Philippa Gregory with this different representation. Of course, we have the stars, actors and actresses, including the girls and Alec Bana representing Henry VIII, and of course this business or industry is getting more and more popular through this film version. Now, this story did not stop here in 2008. Then we come to the Tudors series, which is a 4-season series in, as you also know, it from Hungarian television or from the British, and Anne Boleyn is given another popular role, partly as a sex symbol. Natalie Dormer is starring Anne Boleyn, and Henry VIII is represented by Jonathan Rhys-Meyers. And as you will see in a second, again, it's...
Tell me.
Your Majesty, I have already given my maidenhead into my husband's hands, and whoever he is, only he will have it.
Oh, Anne.
Because I know how it goes otherwise. My sister is called the Great Prostitute by everyone. You know, I sometimes wish that all Spaniards were at the bottom of the sea.
Okay, so what I wanted to show here is, again, as part of the Tudor series, Anne Boleyn comes on the stage, but again, more celebrities, more costumes, more colorful, spectacular representation is entailed. Now, the second scene I would like to show is influenced by Philippa Gregory's original novel, The Other Boleyn Girl, when Anne Boleyn is visited by her sister Mary Boleyn in the Tudors series. Again, this is a very short part, just to show you.
Madame la Marquise. No, just sister.
How are you, sister?
How are both of you?
We are both very well.
Listen, the king and I have visited a famous astrologer who confirmed what the physicians say and what I know in my heart, that it's a boy. The king is overjoyed. He keeps wanting to tell people, but I tell him not to. Not yet, anyway.
Okay, as you can see, well, this is a very long series, and for time reasons, I will skip the next episode. Of course, there are many documentaries made about the Tudors, including Anne Boleyn. This documentary, I'm not going to show you in details, would examine the portrayal of Anne Boleyn, how she could be imagined, or how she looked like in reality. And the documentary makers came to the conclusion that it is very dubious how we can imagine Anne Boleyn, because there is only a very small image found on Anne Boleyn in Hever Castle, which was her home, private family castle. And for time reasons, I'm skipping this documentary on Anne Boleyn, but you can investigate if you're interested in the representation, the portrayal of, or the image of Anne Boleyn herself. Now, in this interview, Philippa Gregory speaks about history sources, and this is quite interesting and revealing. So,
to rely on both, of course, there's an enormous amount of secondary material, and when you come particularly to the Tudors, you know, you would suffocate under the avalanche of histories of the Tudors. There's a real advantage in that for me, that some of the best work that's been done on them has been done by Victorian historians, and they did a lot of the translation. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the primary material is in Latin or sometimes Old French, and I couldn't read that, I couldn't work from that directly. So I'm bound to use republished material. And then
okay, so this is when she tells that she cannot read the records. Now let me tell you a few sentences about the second case study, which is the White Queen, which is the most recent BBC series from Philippa Gregory's works. It came out in 2013. It's a 10-part BBC series. You may have known about it, where the White Queen refers to Elizabeth Woodville, the later wife of Edward IV, and the conflict between the White Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, and the Red Queen, who is Margaret Beaufort. The Wars of the Roses, I don't really have time for. If I teach students at the university, of course, we would go into details about the both the bibliography, primary sources, and secondary history sources for the Wars of the Roses itself. Sometimes I even distribute some letters and acts to get them acquainted with the source material, and of course also we read from secondary literature. I also wanted to point out that it's not only historians criticizing Philippa Gregory's works, but also film reviews, including Gerald O'Donovan writing about the dramatization of history with its serious failings, and the film itself was shot in Belgium, but for budget reasons. But except for that, it's not academically or aesthetically a successful piece. Bernadette McNulty wrote that it's with psychologically fleshing out figures barely drawn in records. And then Elizabeth Woodville is presented by Philippa Gregory. She speaks about her, but for time reasons I'm skipping this. There are many records for the Wars of the Roses, history records. If somebody reads Latin or Middle English, then you can get acquainted with Gregory's, Harding's Chronicles, Philip Comines, Warren Fabian is a Londoner, the Croyland Chronicles. There are several records in the British Museum and at Oxford intact, so it's researchable. Again, Philippa Gregory gave an interview, speaks about the witchcraft, how fascinated she is with witchcraft. And then what I would like to close this presentation is two sequences from The White Queen. The first episode, which is about the meeting of Elizabeth Woodville meeting Edward IV. This is a very romantic scene. Elizabeth Woodville with her two children, born from a Lancastrian, a Red Rose party husband who is now dead, goes to the forest and waits the arrival of the future Edward IV. The husband was Sir John Grey, who was a Lancastrian, and Edward IV is from the Yorkist party. So this is a highly idealized meeting. Now, the second sequence or episode I would finish my presentation with is on the Battle of Bosworth, which took place on the 22nd of August, 1485. August, let me emphasize August, because in the film you will see snow. And how come that in England, in the summertime, in late August, you would find snow scenes? It's not to be explained with the film being shot in Belgium, but they want to emphasize the White Queen, the color symbolism of the film. Of course, once we study history records on Henry Tudor, the Lancastrian Red Rose family, then Polydore Virgil, an Italian contemporary, describes him as a very religious man, very wise man, while we all know from Shakespeare that Richard III is always depicted in history as an evil hunchback, according to the black legend, brought down to us by Dominic Mancini, Rose, Edward Hall, and so on. So we have the meeting of the evil Richard III, killed on the battlefield. And let me emphasize that the Battle of Bosworth is taking place in a field. Now, as you can see in the film, you will see a forest, okay, very soon. Again, some reviews. It's emphasizing that the White Queen is falling between two stools, not serious enough for the scholars, not glitzy enough for the Game of Thrones fans. And let me show you the last scene to illustrate this Battle of Bosworth. This is the future Henry VII, Henry Tudor. You can see the snow. To conclude, Kingsford's Chronicle, the Royal Title Act, and Edward Hall's Chronicles would all describe it or depict it differently. Thank you very much for your attention, and you can conclude it for yourself.